Hi, welcome back to Bad Things in History. This week, I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Chris DeRose, author of The Fighting Bunch, the fascinating story of the only successful armed rebellion on U.S. soil since the American Revolution. It took place less than a century ago, and it's a really good read. I recommend every American, and frankly everyone who can read or listen to English, to enjoy this book in print or audiobook format. Let's jump to it. So, hi, YouTube. We are Bad Things in History, and this is author Chris DeRose. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
That's it.
All right. And we are here to discuss today the book, The Fighting Bunch. Will you briefly give us an elevator speech? Tell us about this book and why people want to read it.
Sure. Well, shortly after World War II, a group of veterans returned to their home to find that it was dominated by a corrupt political machine and that the liberties that they were fighting for overseas were not available to them in the place where they grew up. So they banded together and formed an all veterans ticket in order to drive this machine out of town. Machine wasn't interested in losing the election, just as they hadn't been for the past 10 years. And the GIs found themselves outgunned, assaulted, arrested, hospitalized, and completely unable to stop the machine from getting the ballot boxes and taking them into the jail. At which point, a small group of these veterans decided that they were going to get guns and march on the jail and demand the ballot boxes and a fair count. And when that wasn't forthcoming, they opened fire on the jail, and there was a 6-hour firefight. We have, for the first and only time in American history, a successful rebellion on U.S. soil.
And what brought your particular attention and interest to these events? You've written a few other history books previously. What made you think, I've got to do this obscure, difficult to research, wild event in history?
I think it's maybe one of the greatest stories in American history, maybe the greatest story to me in American history, of these World War II veterans, the story of the greatest generation coming back and fighting one last battle on their home soil for their rights. Really such a fantastic story, and one where you can tell there's a lot of interest, right? If you go and you put the Battle of Athens into Twitter, I mean, you guys were working on a video before you even knew there was a book out, right?
Uh-huh.
So the interest is out there in this story. People know about the basics of the Battle of Athens, but to give it a full 360-degree treatment, I thought there was a huge gap in the history there. And so hopefully I was able to provide that for people who are interested in what the Battle of Athens was and what really happened there and then what happened afterward. So it's a combination of this just being an incredible story and then the opportunity being there to really give it the full in-depth treatment.
Well, the full in-depth treatment seems to be kind of tricky business, right? I understand there was a book written in maybe the 1980s, which portrayed events in, as one person related it to us, a manner that was kind of partisan and intended to be kind of a propaganda piece.
So Stephen Byram, who wrote that book, is definitely no propagandist. He's a great historian, and he was very gracious as a resource to me while I was writing this.
Uh-huh.
But if you're writing this book in Athens in the 1980s, there's a lot going on there. If you want to be able to continue to live in Athens, you can't really go around trashing people who are your neighbors or your friends or your colleagues.
So perhaps less propaganda than discretion.
There are things you just couldn't say if you're writing. I mean, this book had to be written by someone who lived outside the county, for starters. But number two, in the 80s, and you'll see this in the book, I mean, there were a lot of things information he was given that he wasn't allowed to use. People were, you could go back 10 years and people wouldn't want to talk to you about this because they're still living in community with one another. And talking about what happened at the Battle of Athens is unnecessarily antagonistic, right? You're talking about how you shot at your neighbor's grandfather. It's really not good, right? I mean, you're not going to want to talk about this. So there's a lot Stephen couldn't write. There's a lot he was given that he couldn't write. There were a lot of people who weren't ready to talk in the 1980s, whose information I was able to get a hold of. And then, there were a lot of records out there that I was able to find that didn't make it into previous books.
So it seems that you may
There's
have
a lot
had
of room to talk about what
both a
happened.
positive and a negative to deal with, in that by the time you came along and were talking to people and researching your book, a lot of the parties were dead or dying. And you had great difficulty actually contacting people simply because they weren't around anymore. So on the surface, at first blush, this seems to be a negative, but it also sounds like it opened up other doors. For instance, there was a safe you had access to that was only available because of the events of, frankly, people dying of old age.
Right. So Jim Buttram was the campaign manager for the GI ticket, and he died in 1980. So I missed him, and Stephen missed him too. He's been dead as long as I've been alive. But his widow died a year or so ago, about a year before I started writing this. And that forced her children to go into an old safe that they had never seen their parents open, a safe that they could remember being around as far back as the 1950s. And everything in there are the private letters and papers of Jim Buttram and the GI executive committee, the GI ticket. Just an incredible bonanza of information. Or the Bill White's audio tapes. They've never been heard outside the White family. They were shared with me. And Bill White spent hours talking about the events leading up to the Battle of Athens, his time in World War II, and he named a lot of names in there. In his telling of it, they weren't just shadowy figures firing on the hill. They were Jimmy Lockmiller, Cecil Kennedy, and Ken Mashburn. And so I was able to go and contact their families and find out what they knew about their relatives' participation in the Battle of Athens. So, yeah, being at a remove from the county and not having to worry about whether whether everyone's happy with the book, right? Just being able to tell the most accurate version I can, and then having access to letters and diaries that wouldn't have been available at the time. I mean, there were a lot of advantages in coming at this when I did. The timing was very good in a lot of ways.
The Bill White tapes really seem like a gold mine in this case. Bill White seems in some ways kind of like a protagonist or kind of hero figure throughout much of the story, even though his role was only one role among really dozens and hundreds of people who were actively involved in this on both sides of the matter. There were antagonist figures such as Crump and the various sheriffs and deputies who came along and that sort of thing. And so you can kind of contrast the sheriff versus Bill White, and you can contrast the machine versus the oppressed people who are struggling under the weight of oppression and who finally kind of have this moment, this watershed moment where everything changes. I was deeply fascinated by Bill White's story in your book, listening to his day-to-day life in World War II, and I was wondering, where did all of this information come from? Was it these tapes? How did all that information come about?
Yeah, so we talked about previous treatments of the Battle of Athens. Mine certainly focuses a lot more on their service in World War II, because I think you can't understand why they took this decisive step to risk their lives, to risk going to jail, unless you understand what they saw and did overseas and what they sacrificed and suffered as combatants in World War II. You don't really have one without the other. And so I knew it would be a challenge, right? People generally, this generation is not very open about their war stories. I interviewed a lot of, would call them, I guess, call them the children, but they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s now. But the children of these people often didn't know anything about their loved ones' service in the war. Bill was an exception to that. Bill not only left these tapes in his family talking about his war service, but he actually gave a long interview to the McMinn County Living Heritage Museum, where they selected a group of veterans in town and interviewed them for the 50th anniversary of World War II. So that was very valuable. UT Knoxville did a veterans oral history project where they interviewed Bill for about 4 hours. And so Bill had done a lot of talking about his time overseas. Plus, there's an entire book written just about, the Second Marines in World War II. That was very helpful. Obviously, there are day-to-day records of combat and what happened, which I was able to get from the National Archives. And so, you put together the puzzle pieces and you get a pretty clear picture of what World War II was like for Bill and some of the other people I wrote about.
Well, there was one particular moment that struck me as Bill White and these other young servicemen, leave their homes, they go off, and the U.S. military feeds these guys this the propaganda information so that they can understand why they're fighting and dying in this war. And they paint this picture of these Japanese people and these German people living essentially lives of slavery under tyrants, in contrast with the freedom of America that you're used to living in. And it seemed to me that at least some of these guys, upon being exposed to this propaganda, were like, hey, wait a second. And they recognized more of a resonance in their life experience among what the German and Japanese life experience was being described as in the propaganda than in the American way of life that didn't really characterize their way of life. And I was wondering, was that essentially kind of your take on it, or did it kind of maybe come across to excess? Like how to phrase it? Did these guys go off to war feeling like they were free Americans, or had they been already living under this kind of oppressive regime locally enough that they already kind of felt oppressed, or kind of discovered that they were oppressed when they joined the service? And that's kind of a long, winding question, but it's kind of a nuanced, difficult thing to ask.
Well, the first thing I would point out is that I wouldn't characterize any of this as propaganda. That people
Well, I mean
sign up.
that in kind of the neutral term.
Yeah, it doesn't. So it doesn't. Right. It does. I don't think it's a neutral term. And so I think it's a pejorative, right? When we talk about propaganda, it usually means that the information there's an ulterior motive for it, and that it's not accurate. I couldn't point to one thing in Prelude to War that would give these guys the wrong idea about who we were fighting, and at least who we were aspiring to be as Americans, right? At least what our values were. And so I think those are correctly articulated in what these guys were told, signing up for war. I do think that to some of I think it depended on who, right? Frank Carmichael said, it was during this training in the military where we're talking about American values and talk about what we're up against in Germany and Japan. So to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not exactly what we have on the ground here in McMinn County. I think to other people, I think it was what they knew, right? I have a letter from a guy in Toledo who wrote someone in Athens and said, since I moved to Toledo, I've never been arrested. It's incredible. Not only have I never been arrested, but nobody's ever even threatened to arrest me. And back in Athens, they threatened, I actually was thrown in jail for talking too much. But here I am, and the only people who get arrested here in Toledo are people who commit crimes. And so he was very shocked by this. But when he lived in Athens, he knew that sometimes you got arrested just to make the deputies some money. But also things got much worse while they were gone. So the regime comes into power in 36, but there's still the county court, which was their legislative body, usually called the county board or county commission elsewhere. The county court was dominated by Republicans, and so it served as a powerful check on the sheriff. And there were still, Republicans elected countywide in 36 and 38. So things start to change after the 1940 election, but then things start getting really bad, 42, 44. And so it's a combination of things, right? First of all, they learned about the rest of the world. They traveled and experienced what the rest of the world was like firsthand. They got this education on American values contrasted with the values of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but also things just got a lot worse while they were gone. So I think it's all of those things I think are at play.
And even prior to their service, at least some of them had been exposed to certain kind of enlightened discussion in civics class, right?
Yeah, so I have a chapter on their civics instruction at the high school, and which was a great find. It actually, that chapter comes from an interview that was given by that civics teacher after the Battle of Athens. And he talked about how he had been hired there because he'd gone to law school, he'd gotten his law degree at night. He was a staffer in the state legislature. And when he became a lawyer, there were no legal jobs. And so he went back to teaching civics at his old high school. And he pointed out, that was just a useful chapter. We can go through his lessons on how law enforcement made money for every arrest they carried out, and whether you were guilty of anything or not, and how it created these perverse incentives to have people arrested for no reason, and how there's this pyramid of people who were profiting off of this system. And so, really inspired, I think, some of these people like Jim Buttram, who was one of his students, to say, we want to get more civically engaged. And of course, the war will interrupt that. But when they come back, they've got these lessons on how their county works. And, they've got his words ringing in their ears that, you can do something about it. This is America.
Well, so at this point, we haven't really talked in great detail about the particulars of the corruption that they were encountering, and how far that went back and kind of what forms that took. What do you see as kind of maybe a good starting point for bringing that to discussion? Do you see Crump as a good starting point, or the local sheriff situation, bringing in the thugs?
We could start anywhere. I think it's important to note that Tennessee at this time is really under the thumb of one man based out of Memphis, Boss Crump. So Boss Crump first started by taking over Memphis, taking over Shelby County. Shelby County is the most populous county in the state. If Shelby County votes decisively for one candidate, it can determine who wins the Democratic primary statewide. To be nominated as the Democrat statewide in Tennessee is tantamount to winning the election. And because Crump was in control of this machine in Memphis, he could decide to legalize gambling, legalize roadhouses, prostitution, and then decide how much of that is going to come back and be used, be put at his disposal. And so he starts helping elect legislators all across Tennessee. He helps starting to elect judges, particularly Supreme Court justices. And he's able to completely get control of the entire state. And so this machine that runs McMinn County is affiliated with the Crump statewide network. And so that's why they can always enjoy the support of the courts, the state police, the National Guard if necessary, the governor, any legislation that they need written in Nashville. So they're part of this very powerful machine. We talked about fee grabbing, the process of earning a fee by making an improper arrest. That's certainly a factor all throughout Tennessee, and that didn't start with Paul Cantrell in 1936 by any stretch. But they do a lot of the same things. The sheriff can decide what's legal and what's illegal in the county. So if you want to open up a casino or you want to have gambling at your bar, sheriff can agree not to bust up your operation, but there's got to be something in it for them, right? And the real corruption, the most corrupt aspect of this regime, is that they simply refused to allow any possibility that they could lose an election. So they would force people, poll watchers, out of polling places at gunpoint. They would openly stuff ballot boxes. They would swap ballot boxes. They would buy votes in the courthouse square in full view of everyone. They would deny legitimate voters the right to cast the ballot. They would allow people from outside the county to vote multiple times. And then at the end of the day, they would count the ballots in secret, and then the result would be whatever they said it was. So really, the way that this county was really more corrupt than not just the rest of the state, but really anywhere else. I mean, there was one attorney general who said these are the worst allegations of voter fraud that have ever been brought to the attention of the Department of Justice.
And so when people reached out to the Department of Justice, of course, this being the United States, swift, decisive action from the federal government came in and cleared everything up, right?
Yeah, right. So I think you got a few things at play. Some more straightforward and less cynical than others. We'll start with the less cynical. At this time, the DOJ doesn't do much to enforce anyone's voting rights. You have, especially when there's no federal candidates on the ballot, it's considered kind of a local matter. That's number one. Number two, certainly the DOJ's got a war to fight. They're distracted and busy with war efforts. But three, and I think this is the most, but I think this played a role to at least some degree. Boss Crump controlled 2 U.S. senators. He controlled a number of members of the House of Representatives. He controlled the Tennessee delegation at the Democratic National Conventions. If you're causing too much trouble for Boss Crump in Tennessee as the DOJ, there's going to be a problem. And the Roosevelt White House and the Truman White House after that were not unaware of this fact. And so there were thousands of affidavits in the possession of the Department of Justice. I've been through hundreds of them. And I was the first person ever to request this file from the Department of Justice. These are completely new sources for work on the Battle of Athens. There are always these, news reports about how all these affidavits were being submitted to the Department of Justice. And I was like, I should go find those. And they still exist. They're in that room. And if you've watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're in that room where the Ark of the Covenant is put at the end of the movie. It's that room, middle of nowhere, miles after miles of just boxes. All these dusty manila envelopes in there have these very serious allegations from people of firsthand experiences of what it was like to be on the home front during World War II, but not to have access to the right to vote. Really incredible stuff, but the Department of Justice did very little.
Well, and so the press steps in in a variety of ways over time. What are some of the more interesting press-related anecdotes that came to your attention?
Yeah, the press did an amazing job here. But you realize that the value of a free press and a democracy is only so good as voters' ability to act on the information they get. So, the Chattanooga Daily Times or Chattanooga News Free Press or Knoxville News Sentinel, Knoxville Journal, the Tennessean, particularly the newspapers outside of McMinn County, right? I mean, the local newspaper really had to kind of play things straight.
And there can be a rather high price to pay sometimes for reporting on these, correct?
Yeah, exactly. If you're the local reporters could find themselves in a lot of trouble for writing the wrong kinds of stories. But some of these bigger regional newspapers had a little bit less to fear, and the reporters were very honest about what was happening in McMinn County. But yeah, the voters could read that and say, yeah, we know we're trying to vote these guys out. It doesn't work. And so that's really the greatest value, right, of a press and to a political system is the ability of citizens to act on what they're reading.
And didn't at least one member of the press lose his life as a result?
Yeah, there was one editor in the neighboring county who had written an expose about bootleggers, and they took the gasoline that he used to clean his printing keys and set him on fire with it. So I mean, this was a dangerous part of the world if you got crosswise with these guys, and so there was certainly a great risk to journalists in writing about this.
So it seems like we have an intractable problem, but then several years of World War II pass, and GIs begin to start coming home in fits and spurts, and then you reach a point where GIs are coming home at least like one in an average day, and they're coming home, getting off the bus, and what sort of treatment are they receiving? Historically, we hear about like Vietnam veterans being received poorly, that sort of thing. But these are the great generation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. These guys were definitely expecting something better than what they came back to, and so you had 3,500 veterans go off to serve in McMinn County, and at least half of them are back. by the summer of 1946. And some of them were being arrested off the bus from war because they had mustering out pay on them. And these deputies knew that they were an easy mark and that they'd have money on them. So the deputies would arrest them off the bus, say they're drinking in public, take them to the jail, take their money, and let them go.
And money is, at this time in history, really delicate. Prior to the Great Depression, things operated kind of a certain way, and then things started changing rapidly. You reach a point where, it's not, for a while, people don't have money. Then people start having money, but there's a war on, and so there's nothing to spend the money on.
Yeah.
So you've got GIs who come back from the war and have to continue wearing their military service uniforms because those are the only clothes they have.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And because the cotton rationing was still in effect, and the cloth rationing was still in effect.
And so, what were the events that really led up to the breaking point on that fateful day? Because the day didn't, at 9 a.m., there wasn't a great battle starting.
No, or if there was, it was a one-sided battle. So the machine looks around. They say, okay, we got all these young tough guys running against us. We just have to have bigger numbers than we're used to on election day. So the sheriff had about 16 deputies, probably another 14 that he could deputize at any given time for special occasions. You had the municipal police forces of cities like Athens and Etowah. And then you had deputies. That was typically enough, right? Sometimes the state police would come in. That was typically enough for the machine to take an election in a county of 30,000 people. That was plenty. They say, okay, we got these guys are back. They're determined. They're tough guys. We're going to need a lot more guns. And so they end up with over 250 men under arms on election day. Just a much bigger fighting force than they had ever had before, which really catches the GIs by surprise. I don't know how it could have, but it does. Sometimes you don't want to
seem that it caught all of them by surprise.
Didn't catch all of them by surprise, but Bill White, like Bill White said, do you think they're really just going to let you win this election? And most of them were like, yeah. There's, what are they going to do? Look at how many of us there are. But the vast majority, and certainly the leadership of the GI ticket, were shocked. And from the minute the polls open, they're doing the same thing. They're arresting poll watchers. They're removing poll watchers. Poll watchers aren't allowed to object. And so it's a cascading series of election fraud and violence throughout the day, just like it had been for years.
So how were people actually treated when they would attempt to vote in a way that was contrary to the wishes of the machine, or would object to someone holding up a ballot for one person, but calling it out for that person's opponent? How were these people treated?
Yeah, some people were allowed to vote, and it was fine. The machine had a lot of armed men at the polling places. They were only letting a few people in at the time, so the lines were artificially long. The machine had already succeeded in cutting by about half the number of polling places that were available to voters. The best case scenario on that election day, you walked into a polling place full of gunmen, cast the ballot with the people running the election aware of how you voted, and with deputies looking over your shoulder, and you were permitted to leave without anything happening to you. It wasn't true for everybody that day, but that was like your best case scenario on August 1st, 1946.
And some of the more worst case scenarios?
You got shot for trying to vote for the GI ticket.
And the GI ticket was a singular event in American history. There's no GI party today. The machine was essentially ostensibly, on the surface, it was labeled as a democratic entity. But I wonder if it really represented the positions and ideals of the Democratic Party, But the GIs weren't necessarily a Republican entity, right? There were people from multiple different party representations and people who didn't necessarily have a party affiliation who came together for the GI ticket.
Yeah, the GI ticket is bipartisan and nonpartisan in the sense that it included Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Because what they realized is that all of their political differences were secondary to actually having free elections in the county and getting rid of this machine. Everything after that, we can wait till after the election. So the GI ticket includes 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans as their 5 countywide candidates. It includes people of all stripes, a lot of independents, a lot of people who'd never voted before because they went off to war before they were old enough to vote. 21 was the voting age at the time. So people who'd never voted, never been active in politics, people of all stripes. The Republican Party didn't field any candidates that cycle. They endorsed the GI ticket. And yeah, I think, look, it's fair to say, right, there were plenty of Democrats opposed to the machine who felt like the machine didn't reflect Democratic values. So the machine, they were members of the Democratic Party, but I mean, really, what are they interested in the county? Perpetuating the system of corruption that had enriched them but oppressed their neighbors.
And so the GI party wasn't actually called the GI party officially. They referred to themselves as something else.
No, well, officially they were the ex-servicemen's cleanup ticket of McMinn County. So as you can imagine, that was nobody used that term. They would refer to themselves as the GI party or the GI ticket or simply the GIs.
And so their name actually reflects their purpose, right? They came together to serve a singular point in history, to come in and clean up the county and hand the power back to the citizens of the county and back to the legal infrastructure that they had learned about in high school, that they knew should exist and should function a certain way. And so after that, after these events, the many bullets flying through the air, dynamiting the jailhouse, the National Guard being called in, this one very exciting day. What happened with the political situation in Athens and McMinn? Did things kind of gradually go back to the old way? Did things kind of stabilize? Did they manage to galvanize the home front and people?
Things got a lot better. Things got a lot better. So the number of arrests, for instance, on a weekend would drop from like 75 to over 100 down to like 15.
Okay.
So if you think about that, that means that 50 to perhaps 100 people every weekend were getting arrested for no good reason. Now that we dropped down to 15. In the 1948 election, Knox Henry's reelected as sheriff, and the Democrats took out a full-page newspaper ad saying, "Thanks for giving us a fair election. You know, we didn't win, but thank you for giving us a fair election." Now contrast that newspaper ad in 1948 with the fact that the previous election got settled with a 6-hour gunfight, and tell me that the situation didn't change. I mean, it's a myth, and it's a myth I'm familiar with, but it's just that it's something without any basis in reality. I'll give you one example. After Knox Henry's second term as sheriff, he's replaced by Otto Kennedy, who was his chief deputy and who was really the leader of wartime opposition in the county as chair of the Republican Party. He ran the entire sheriff's office for what Pat Mansfield had spent just for food alone, or at least what I should say Pat Mansfield billed the county for food alone, for one line item, in an era where food was cheap. Otto Kennedy was able to run the whole sheriff's office 6 years later for just what the food budget had been. So there's no comparison between what had happened before and what followed it. And there were newspapermen who were intimately familiar with the county, like Willard Yarborough, who was a native of McMinn County, who was a prominent regional journalist, who did like a 1-year retrospective piece to see, hey, what's it like a year after the Battle of Athens? And he says you can't compare the two, it's night and day. And so, the idea that nothing there's a myth out there that the people who ruled McMinn County between 36 and 46 were really no worse or no different than the people who preceded them. That's completely not true. And then another, I think, part of that myth is that, well, things didn't really get better after they left office, and that's demonstrably false.
So, after all of these events, the community has to heal.
Yeah,
Families still have to live neighbor to neighbor, business
right.
to business. Even people who had been violently opposed
Yeah.
with guns pointed at one another were. Are there any particular cases you can think of that seem interesting to you of people who had been opponents and
Yeah.
foes, adversaries who came together, forgave each other, became friends, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. This is interesting. So I interviewed Ann Davis, whose father was held hostage in a polling place on Election Day, 1946. He was a GI named Charles Scott Jr., nicknamed Shy Scott. She considers the daughter of Paul Cantrell, who was the leader of the previous government of McMinn County. She considers the daughter of Paul Cantrell to be like a surrogate mother to her. They do holidays together. Paul Wilson, who's the grandson of Paul Cantrell, told me that some of the most important friendships in his life outside of his own family are with GIs who were either part of the GI movement against his grandfather or were actual combatants in the Battle of Athens. And so everywhere you look are these friendships across, and sometimes very close friendships across this previous divide. Really an impressive example of how a community can reconcile. And I think, look, we were talking about myths in the previous question. Those myths helped with that healing, right? The idea that, there's accountability on both sides. Let's just move forward. I think, right, those stories, we tell stories as a people because those stories serve purposes. And I think the idea that things really weren't that bad in the county between 36 and 46 is a story that served a purpose to the people who had to reconcile with each other and move forward. But today we need to tell the story accurately and in a way that does honor to the victims of the machine over that 10-year period.
Well, Cantrell is an interesting figure who can appear to be kind of a villainous character through much of the story. What actually came of him when everything shook out?
Yeah, he returns to being a member of the community, and he's welcomed back pretty shortly after the Battle of Athens. And I remember his grandson told me that his grandfather never carried a gun into town. And this is a part of the world where people carry guns as a matter of course, whether they're afraid of someone or not, they'll have a gun on them. But Paul Cantrell never feared any sort of reprisal from the people of McMinn County. And it's a testament to the emphasis that they put on reconciliation and just getting on with things.
Was there anything that we haven't touched on yet about the events of that day that are particularly interesting to you?
I mean, I think there's a long list of them. There's about 80,000 words worth. And I put them all in the book. So, no, we could go on all day and talking about everything that I found worthy of inclusion in this. But I think we've hit a lot of high points. And I think your watchers will have a very good idea of what happened here and why.
Well, in your book, you didn't just relay a bunch of static events in sequence. You told a story that was actually an interweaving of many stories, individuals, families, community, uh, Cherokee legend, if I recall correct.
Yeah.
Kind of made an interesting kind of front and end cap, and it
Thank you.
made me really want to know a great deal more about these events, which I may not be able to find out much more, but it also made me wonder a little bit more about some of your other books. Our researcher for Bad Things in History, who put together the write-up for these events, actually, when we were looking over the books that you've read, one of them he's like, oh, I think I've read that book. And so can you briefly mention, like, what are some of the other things you've written about, and what should I read next?
So, look, I was just a history lover like you guys before I ever became an author and a big reader. And so I try to write the kind of things that I'd want to read about, where I think, oh, sorry about that. I try to write the kind of things that I'd want to read about. So my first book was about this congressional election between these two future presidents, Madison and Monroe. Because Madison wins over Monroe, we get our Bill of Rights and the country stays together when it might have broken up. But this first, there has to be this congressional race between these two future presidents. And so it's a fascinating chapter, an event in history that really gets overlooked. I wrote a book about Abraham Lincoln as a member of Congress. I wrote a book about the 5 former presidents who lived to see the Civil War and what they did during the war and how they interacted with Lincoln and with the Union and the Confederacy. And I wrote a book about really the first celebrity murder trial in American history, the trial of Congressman Daniel Sickles for the murder of Barton Key, son of Francis Scott Key, and U.S. Attorney for Washington, for having an affair with his wife. So I try to find these areas of history that I feel like are underserved, and I just want to share these interesting stories with people. And so I think what you read next is highly dependent on where your interests are, but I think there's probably something for everyone.
All right. Well, off the top of your head, who was the worst president in U.S. history?
Andrew Johnson, failure of Reconstruction, giving back the gains of the Civil War to the former Confederate states as fast as he can, taking those incredible gains and those incredible opportunities that were won and that were paid for with so many American lives and loss of treasure, and allowing Reconstruction to fail. And so we end up with 2 different legal systems, 2 different Americas for Black and white Americans, for legally speaking, for at least 100 years. But many of the pernicious effects obviously continue to the present day. So Johnson's the worst, and he should be in a category by himself.
Chris DeRose, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
We're absolutely thrilled to have this interview with you. And
my pleasure. Thank you for the enthusiasm for the book. I really appreciate it.
It's such an extremely good book. We have to consume so much history content for this channel, and so much of it is dry and difficult and boring and doesn't get to the point. Your book read like a very well-written novel.
Well, thank you. You do something for 10 years and eventually you get good at it. And so I feel like it's certainly the best thing I've ever written, and I'm very proud of the way it turned out. And just a matter of becoming a better writer as I got older. And you try to, that was the goal, right? The goal was to make it read like a novel, but to be completely nonfiction and to be accurate in every respect, and just let this incredible story do the work.
Excellent. We thank you, and we hope you have a fine day.
Thank you.
Maybe next time you have a new book out, perhaps we'll have the opportunity to see you again.
I would love that. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this interview and you found it left you wanting more, be sure to read or listen to Chris DeRose's book, linked in the description below, or check out our own video posted back in September on the same subject. Thanks again for watching Bad Things in History, and we'll see you next time.